Welcome to True Reddit Stories. Have you ever imagined your whole life turning upside down in a single morning? A model father suddenly arrested for a crime. He didn't commit a mother completely falling apart, and the person everyone trusts to step in the one who ends up being the culprit behind it all. Today I'll share the journey of a child caught in the storm, brave enough to stand up to a dangerous manipulator and expose all the lies to win back justice for their family. If you've ever felt small and powerless in the face of injustice, listen all the way to the end, because maybe, just maybe, you'll recognize a piece of yourself somewhere in this story. Chapter 1. The 6 a.m. Shock. If you've ever thought nightmares only happen on TV, let me tell you about that morning. A perfectly ordinary morning, until everything in my life came crashing down to the sound of police sirens. I still remember the blurry light filtering through the curtains, just another school day for a 14-year-old. And then, with no warning, the whole house shook with pounding on the door and shouts of FBI echoing down the hallway. They burst in faster than anyone could process what was happening. My dad was dragged out of bed still in those old Spider-Man pajamas I'd given him for his birthday. My mom collapsed in the front yard, sobbing uncontrollably, and I could only stand there frozen, feeling like I'd suddenly turned invisible. I'll never forget the look in my dad's eyes in that moment, still trying to smile at me, still trying to reassure me, even while handcuffed, even as his world fell apart around him. They didn't let him hug me one last time. They didn't care to listen when he said he was innocent, and in a split second, he disappeared from my world. People always say that tragedy brings a family closer together, but in reality, it's nothing like that. Just 48 hours later, my life already had a replacement. Richard, the boss at my mom's accounting firm, the same place my dad had worked for 15 years, showed up at our door with 3 bags, a face full of sympathy, and a voice so gentle it felt fake. "Marina, you can't get through this alone," he said, then strolled right into our house, like he'd always belonged there. By then, my mom was just a shadow of herself. Each day that passed, she seemed to shrink a little more, letting Richard move into the living room as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He didn't even ask, he just brought 3 suitcases like he'd planned it all along. All I could do was watch it happen, feeling angry and helpless, as if I was being swept into a storm I had no control over. That very first night, Richard sat right down in Dad's seat at the dinner table, lifted Dad's familiar coffee mug to his lips, and even kindly cut my meat for me as if I was still 5. "We'll get through this together, kiddo," he said. I hated the way he called me kiddo. It was such a weird, forced word, so unnatural it made me want to gag. Dad never called me that, but I knew I had to play the obedient kid. I pretended to listen, even helped Richard pack up Dad's things, because Mom told me to be grateful, sweetheart. I brought dinner to the table, pretended to appreciate him coming to my soccer games, even though he never remembered what position I played, and couldn't stop staring at his phone when I needed my mom the most my first period, my first real panic. She wasn't there, tied up with lawyers and Richard, even the nightmares I had about Dad in prison. Richard thought could be solved by buying me a new laptop instead of sitting down to talk. I started writing letters to Dad, hiding them between my textbooks, the only way I could feel like he was still with me. Every night, I'd still set a place for him at dinner, and when Richard was busy, I'd sneak on Dad's old hoodie, even though it was baggy, and Mom said I was obsessed. Sometimes I could still smell his cologne on it, the scent of memories of happier days. But everything really crossed the line as Dad's birthday approached. It was the first time he'd have a birthday in prison. I'd been saving up spare change for 3 months, determined to do all the visitation paperwork myself. But when I asked Mom about it, it was Richard who answered, "That weekend's no good. I've got an important client party, and the whole family needs to be there so I can make a good impression." Mom immediately backed him up, saying, "Your dad will understand, honey. Richard needs our support right now." I was so mad, I cried. When I reminded them Dad was innocent, Richard snapped, "Innocent people don't have Cayman accounts. Wake up, kid." That night, Mom rifled through my bag and took all the money I'd saved, saying it was for your own good. I heard her crying behind the door, but she never gave the money back. For the first time, I felt truly alone in the house that used to be full of laughter. My dad was somewhere in prison, and Richard was slowly becoming my new dad, stealing everything that had belonged to my family. But maybe he'd underestimated me, because from that moment on, I swore I'd find out the truth, and I wouldn't let him destroy my dad or me without a fight. Chapter 2: When the Invader Took Control. You wouldn't believe how quickly Richard wormed his way into every corner of my life. At first, it was just empty words of encouragement, some fake gestures of kindness towards my mom. But within weeks, he'd turned this house into his own territory. Honestly, I started to suspect that Dad ending up in jail and Richard showing up was a calculation I was the last to figure out. Richard declared himself the protector of both my mom and me. He went to parent-teacher meetings instead of mom attended all my school events and even called my homeroom teacher to check on my academic progress as if I were still in kindergarten. Worse, he started controlling everything from whether I could go out to what things I was allowed to buy. Anytime I pushed back, Mom would just sigh exhausted and say, "Please try to understand Richard. He's helping us get through this." But that kind of help left a bitter taste in my mouth. I had never seen my mom so weak before. She used to be strong, the one who protected Dad and me through every storm. Now she quietly turned into a shadow, following Richard, ready to agree to any request, no matter how unreasonable. Even my private matters, Mom let Richard meddle with. Like my phone, he installed monitoring software, so every message, every call had to be reviewed by him. I felt like a prisoner being watched 24/7 in my own house. Sometimes I wondered what I had done to deserve living like this. Whenever something went wrong at school, Richard was always the first person the teachers called, not my mom, and certainly not my dad. He'd have talks with me about my future, about my career, about how I should be grateful to him for sacrificing to help us through the crisis. But all I felt was suffocation, loss, and fear. He even bought me luxuries like a new laptop designer clothes, as if money could fill the emptiness inside me. But he never remembered what I actually liked or wanted. Once, when I had stomach cramps on my first day of my period, Mom was at a meeting with the lawyer and Richard at the office, so I had to find a hot towel and warm water myself, gritting my teeth and enduring it alone. That night, I put on Dad's old hoodie, sat in my room, and cried, hoping somehow he could still hear me. I started getting isolated from my friends. Richard loved showing off to the neighbors that he was stepping up to fill the shoes of a failed father. Even my closest friends were limited in how much they could contact me. Dad was labeled a criminal, and I became the criminal's kid. Friends slowly drifted away, and even my teachers looked at me with pity. The worst was when I tried to tell Mom that things weren't right. She just shook her head, eyes full of tears. "Your father already put this family through enough. Please don't make it any harder." She had no idea all I wanted was to protect her, to pull her out of the trap Richard was weaving tighter every day. I used to think if I just held on, things would pass. But the feeling of being smothered, controlled, of having Richard become my new dad, day by day, it all started to ignite a small fire inside me, burning slowly. Maybe Richard thought I was just a weak little girl that I'd break under his pressure. But I knew this suffocation was going to push me to fight back, to find justice for Dad and for myself. I don't know what I'll have to face next, but I swear I won't let Richard destroy my family for one more day. Chapter 3: When I realized I was being silenced. After weeks of living in this new family Richard had created, I started to notice strange signs, things I'd been too sad or scared to see before. It was a silent kind of control that crept into every corner. My phone had tracking apps, my computer was loaded with a keylogger, and even my social media accounts had their passwords changed. If I tried to log in or chat with old friends, Richard would immediately get a notification on his phone. I realized I had no privacy left, not a single space that was truly my own. But the worst part was that Mom gradually started believing everything Richard said about me, that I was rebellious, paranoid, that I needed therapy. Just because I tried to defend Dad, tried to look for the truth, my own mother thought I needed to be cured. Richard gently planted doubts in her mind, so every time I tried to stand up for myself, Mom would just sigh and give me that pitying look, as if I were an emotionally unstable child. There were nights when I couldn't sleep. I'd lie awake, listening to Richard and Mom whispering downstairs about future plans about their new happiness. Of course, Dad was never part of those conversations. I felt like an outsider in my own home. I started writing even more letters to Dad, letters that might never reach him. Every line was a silent promise. I will find the truth. I don't believe you're a bad person. One day, I accidentally overheard Richard on the phone, his voice tense and low. I didn't catch the whole conversation, but a few lines sent chills down my spine. As long as the kid doesn't make a scene, she'll accept the new life. I know how to control children. That night, I decided I would never let myself be turned into some obedient doll. I started secretly keeping notes about everything that seemed off, the times Richard logged into my accounts, the way Mom's attitude towards me would suddenly change after spending time alone with Richard, and how he silently took control of the family finances, as if he was quietly pushing both me and Mom out of any real decision making. One day, when I was getting ready for school, Richard said he'd drive me because traffic is dangerous. But really, it was just so he could control who I talked to. Sitting in the car, he asked, "You really think your dad is innocent?" Kiddo, sometimes people aren't what we think they are. I just stared out the window, thinking about how Dad used to write, "Roar means I love you" on my lunchbox when I was little. Even with everyone against him, I still believed Dad was innocent. At school, people started talking about my family. Curious, pitying glances. Worst of all was the growing distance. Even my best friend kept her distance. I felt like a ghost, invisible and forgotten. Every time I gathered the courage to tell someone the truth, Richard would twist the story, making me out to be a problem child. I'll never forget the day Mom took back all the money I'd saved up to visit Dad. She said it was for my future, but really, it was because Richard didn't want me getting close to Dad anymore. That night, I tried sneaking out to take the bus to see him, but I only made it a few dozen meters before the police brought me home. Richard just sighed and shook his head. The girl needs psychological treatment. Gradually, I was locked up tight in an invisible cage called protection. Friends, happiness, freedom. Everything was being squeezed out of me. But the more trapped I felt, the more I wanted to break free. I knew that if I didn't do something, I really would disappear from my own life, and Dad would forever carry the label of a criminal. And then one night, everything started to change, beginning with a drunken whisper from Richard in my dad's old office. Chapter 4: The Watch and the Secret in the Night. If anyone ever asks what moment changed everything, I wouldn't hesitate. It was the night Richard came home drunk, his face flushed, glass of liquor in hand, mumbling to himself in my dad's office. He sat in that familiar chair, the one only my dad ever dared to use. I stood outside the door, barely daring to breathe, listening to every word Richard said. That old man. Thought he was so clever. Hiding a recorder in the office like some kind of detective, I had to take it out myself to show him. His voice was slurred, but every word was clear. I froze. A recorder? Did Dad record something the night before he was arrested? Richard gradually slipped deeper into his drunkenness, passing out right at the desk, leaving me with 1,000 questions. I snuck into the room, hands trembling as I searched for any clue. But everything was spotless, chillingly neat, except for one small detail. Dad's smartwatch, which I had once set up for him, was not on the list of items seized by the police. I remembered that Richard always hid a separate set of car keys in a cabinet in the basement. While he slept, I took a chance, grabbed those keys, and crept down to the garage. My heart was pounding out of my chest. In the glove compartment of the Lexus, I found a small plastic bag, and inside was Dad's watch. Even though it was old and nearly dead, I managed to turn it on. The screen showed just 2% battery left. I quickly opened the recording app, and just as I hoped, the last recording popped up, 23:41, the night before the arrest. I put on headphones and heard Dad's voice clearly. Richard just left my office. He threatened to plant evidence if I don't destroy the audit reports. I'm recording all this just in case. Then Richard's cold voice. By tomorrow morning, you'll be in handcuffs. I've transferred the money into your account. Marina will never know what you did. I'll take good care of her and your wife. I gripped the watch tightly, tears streaming down my face before I even realized. The end of the recording was chaos, things crashing, Dad shouting, "Get away, don't take the watch," Richard growling, "Give it here." Then everything went silent. I knew that with this recording, Dad could be cleared, but how could I get the file out when my phone and computer were all under Richard's control? I sat quietly in the car, calculating every step. If I slipped up, I wouldn't just endanger myself. I could put both Mom and Dad at greater risk. Just then, the garage door flew open. Richard stood in the doorway, eyes sharp and clear. "What are you looking for, kiddo?" He wasn't the least bit drunk anymore. I startled, gripping the watch behind my back. A long, tense silence filled the air. Richard walked slowly into the garage, voice steady. "Your mom would be upset if she saw you messing around like this. Show me what you found." I didn't dare react, only swallowed hard. Right at that moment, the neighbor's garage light flicked on. Mrs. Chen, the kind old Chinese lady, came out to take out her trash, humming folk songs as she walked. I saw my chance to escape, pretended to drop the keys, then dashed into the car, slammed the door, and locked it. Richard pounded on the window, his face twisted, but he didn't dare make a scene while Mrs. Chen was outside. I clung to the watch like it was a treasure. That night, I learned a major lesson. Sometimes to protect the truth, you have to be ready to stand up to even the most powerful darkness. But everything was just beginning. I knew I had to find a way to copy that recording out before Richard could destroy it, because now he knew I held the secret that could bring him down. Chapter 5: The Cat and Mouse Game. When Richard struck back. After that night, everything became so suffocating I could barely breathe. Richard stopped hiding. He started openly controlling everything I did. My phone was reset, all my email and social media accounts were locked, and every bit of my personal data was checked. The official reason you need to be protected from harmful information online. Mom went along with it, just nodding her eyes, always red and tired. But Richard didn't stop there. He began building his image as the new father in front of the neighbors' teachers and even my friends. He attended parent-teacher meetings, came to my soccer games, but spent the whole time glued to his phone. He pretended to be friendly, calling me kiddo in front of everyone, but at home, he only reminded me about the consequences of rebelling. Things got worse when I tried to send the audio file from Dad's watch to a school computer. The parental controls Richard had set up immediately alerted him on his phone. That night, he quietly came into my room, sat down on the edge of my bed, and spoke in a soft voice. "You think you're smarter than the adults? Don't ruin your future over something delusional, kiddo." Then he gave me an ultimatum. If I handed over all the evidence, he would tell your mom to forgive you, and everything would go back to the way it was. If not, I would have to pay the price. I understood immediately he wasn't just afraid of his crimes being exposed, he was terrified of losing his absolute control, but I had no way out either. The only truth I knew was this. If I gave up, now Dad would never be cleared, and I would forever be a puppet in my own family. I began making secret plans, borrowing a classmate's phone, creating an anonymous email, uploading the recording to the cloud. Every step had to be extremely careful. I even enlisted Mrs. Chen, our neighbor, the one who'd witnessed Richard yelling in the garage that night, to be a witness if necessary. Thankfully, she agreed, and even gave me a brand new USB stick. Every night, I wrote a diary documenting everything Richard did. The threats, the controlling behavior, Mom's strange actions, the small details only someone living in the house would notice. I trusted no one but myself. And that recording watch was the only thing keeping me sane. But Richard grew more and more tense, sensing I was hiding something. He deliberately caused conflicts with my mom to make me look like the one ruining the family's happiness. Every time I pushed back, Mom just shook her head, looking at me with pity, as if I was some rebellious child. I was forced to see a psychologist of Richard's choosing. The doctor drilled me about my obsession with Dad and fear of losing control. I could feel them setting me up as someone with psychological problems, fitting right into the script. Richard wanted the unstable daughter who needs to be protected. In those days of constant surveillance, I realized simply collecting evidence wasn't enough. I had to wait for the right moment, the right person, and the right situation, so the truth couldn't be denied. I started nudging Mom to pay attention to little things. How Richard always tried to keep me from seeing Dad the times he withdrew money from the family account without asking, and his odd reactions whenever Dad's name came up. Every night, I looked at the little box filled with the notes Dad used to leave. Roar means I love you in dinosaur. That was my only motivation to keep standing even as the whole world seemed to turn its back on me. I knew this cat and mouse game was far from over. But I had a plan now, and this time, Richard would never expect that the easily controlled little girl he thought he knew would be the one to bring everything into the light. Chapter 6. The truth begins to surface. There were mornings when I woke up feeling like I was living in a play where everyone else was playing a part except me. Mom kept pretending everything was fine, burying herself in work or parent meetings with Richard. As for me, I quietly collected every scrap of evidence, every scattered puzzle piece in this dangerous game. I realized that if I wanted to save Dad and myself, I needed something more powerful, something undeniable. The smartwatch had captured the final audio recording, but a single audio file wasn't enough to take down someone as cunning as Richard, especially when he had money power and a whole network of connections surrounding him. One day, I remembered how our family used to use a cloud account to store old footage from our security cameras, something no one really paid attention to anymore. Digging through the data, I couldn't believe my eyes. There was a video from a few months back showing Richard alone in the living room, practicing his expressions in the mirror, repeating the story he would tell the police about my dad's strange behavior. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was a perfect puzzle piece, proving Richard had prepared everything in advance: the story, the lies. I printed out copies, sent the files to a lawyer who knew my dad, and secretly asked my best friend to be my digital witness, so if anything happened, there would be someone to verify what I had sent. School wasn't any easier. Friends drifted away after hearing rumors like the embezzler's daughter and that paranoid girl who needs therapy. Even teachers who once liked me kept their distance, afraid that saying the wrong thing might drag them into trouble. Only Mrs. Chen would sometimes stop by bringing me a hot steamed bun and quietly asking, "Are you all right?" One night I overheard Richard on the phone with a stranger, his voice low, talking about taking care of the audio before anyone finds it. I started shaking, realizing he wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to protect himself. The very next morning, I made my final move. I sent all the documents, the audio file, the video, and my diary of threats to the prosecutor's office, and at the same time to a well-known investigative newspaper in the city. I thought I'd feel relieved, but I didn't. All I felt was worry and exhaustion. For days, Richard acted as if nothing was happening, putting on an even bigger show of caring for my mom, buying flowers, making breakfast, driving her to work. He even joked with me about family trust, but I knew the storm was only a matter of time. Then, the first messages arrived. Dad's lawyer confirmed he had received all the evidence and promised to work with investigators. Mrs. Chen said she'd gotten a call about that night in the garage, proof that someone was starting to check every detail. It seemed like everything was coming to an end, but I knew this was only the beginning of a battle far longer than I had ever imagined. Maybe I'd lose friends. Maybe I'd even lose the way Mom saw me. But I'd made my choice. I chose to stand on the side of truth, even if it meant facing an entire system, facing the most powerful man I'd ever known, right in my own home. Chapter 7. My mother believed a stranger, and I became the problem child. Not everyone can imagine what it feels like for a teenager to stand in the middle of a legal battle where the enemy is their own stepfather. Nor can most people understand what it's like to want to hug your mother and comfort her while at the same time silently fighting against everything she says, knowing she's been manipulated. I gradually got used to being the problem child in everyone's eyes, both at home and at school. In the days waiting for a response from the police, I drifted through life like a sleepwalker. No friends checked in on me anymore. Only Mrs. Chen would occasionally leave pastries by my window in secret. Even my mom, the person who used to be my biggest support, became distant. Every morning before school, I watched her folding Richard's shirts, stacking his washcloths, things that used to be my job and Dad's job, and my heart felt frozen. Richard became more and more proactive in controlling my life. I had to come home from school exactly on time, and every activity on my phone was monitored. In the evenings, he forced me to sit down to dinner with him and Mom, lecturing me about family values, which just made me want to throw up. Once I accidentally broke one of Dad's old glasses, and Richard just looked at me with cold eyes and smiled. It's all right. Everything can be replaced, even memories, but I still tried to keep a small fire burning inside me, the box of Dad's notes, the audio files that had been safely sent out, the journal entries I wrote every night, and my own promise that no one could ever erase the truth. The turning point came on a Saturday morning when the police knocked at the door. This time it wasn't to arrest Dad, but to ask about the recording watch and the video evidence. Richard played the part of the model family man, quickly inviting the officers and pouring tea, chatting with perfect calm. He had no idea they were there because of me and that I had prepared all the evidence. When the police asked about the days leading up to Dad's arrest, I told them everything I knew, including how Richard was always making late-night phone calls, practicing lies in front of the mirror, and constantly stopping me from contacting Dad. I even asked Mrs. Chen to confirm she was at the garage. That night, she was the one who heard the argument and saw me run outside with the watch. That's when Richard started to lose his composure. He tried to act normal, but his voice shook. He accused me of making things up, said I was mentally unstable from lacking a father. I just quietly handed the officers a USB drive with the recording and copies of my journal, all carefully time-stamped. The atmosphere was incredibly heavy. My mom sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her face while Richard's face turned gray. The police didn't arrest anyone that day, but I knew things would never go back to how they were. That night, I didn't sleep. Mom cried out in the hallway, and I just hugged Dad's box of notes, praying that this would finally come to an end. I was no longer the naive child waiting for a miracle. I had chosen to fight, and there was no turning back. Chapter 8. The Final Counterattack. I used to think everything would be over once the police got the evidence that as long as the truth came out, justice would prevail. But life is never that simple. In the days after the police visit, Richard's true face was on full display. He stopped pretending to be the devoted stepfather, stopped patiently smiling at my mom. He became irritable, controlling everything more strictly than ever. Everywhere I went, everything I did had to be reported, and he even did random checks on my phone. But I wasn't afraid anymore. The worst fear was already behind me, the fear that I'd never be able to save Dad. Now I had only one goal left: to bring the truth into the light, no matter if it cost me my reputation, relationships, or anything else. The evidence had reached exactly the right hands. Dad's lawyer called to say that the investigation had officially been reopened, that the recordings and videos meant the prosecutors could no longer ignore the case. People in Richard's company started whispering, the security guards, the secretaries, even Dad's old boss began calling to check on my family. Rumors spread, and more people stepped up to confirm the suspicious details of Dad's case. Some even sent anonymous letters to the court. And then the first hearing finally took place. My mom sat right beside Richard, her face pale, while I sat in the back, alone with Dad's box of notes in my hands. For the first time, I felt the loneliness of fighting for the truth. To outsiders, I was just a troublesome kid, and the bad guys were always confident that no one would dare to go against them. But when the recording played in the hearing room, the atmosphere froze. You could hear Richard's snarling voice. "You think you can bring me down?" Then my dad shouting, "Don't do it! I have evidence!" Then the sounds of a struggle and the watch hitting the floor. It was all too real for anyone to claim it was faked. My mom was in shock. She cried without making a sound, and Richard's face turned ashen, shaking like he'd lost all control. When Dad's lawyer asked Richard about the days leading up to the arrest, he just stayed silent, then tried to give some feeble excuses. Right at that moment, an employee from the accounting department stood up and confirmed that Richard had threatened them, and then another did the same. The wall of silence had started to crack. Back home, I felt a strange sense of relief. Not because everything was over, but because I knew I was no longer alone. No matter what happened tomorrow, no matter if Mom blamed me or friends turned away, I had done the right thing. That night, I took all the "roar means I love you" in dinosaur notes from Dad and stuck them all over my door. For the first time in months, I slept without any nightmares. And I knew the day justice arrives, late as it may be, will come. And this time, nothing and no one will be able to stop me anymore. Chapter 9. Justice is Named. I used to think that once the truth was brought to light, all the pain would disappear. But in reality, truth and justice are two things that almost never arrive at the same time. The days waiting for the results of the investigation dragged on endlessly. Richard was suspended from work right after the hearing, but he was still free, still wandering around my mother as if nothing had changed. My family split into two clear sides. My mother grew more and more haggard, always staying in her room with the door shut. Sometimes I'd hear her sobbing and making phone calls, maybe to my grandmother or my aunt in another state. I knew my mother was hurting, but I also knew she'd let Richard manipulate her for too long, letting things spiral out of control. I was living almost completely independently. Schoolwork became harder, but I still tried my best to finish every assignment, every class, just to keep some sense of normalcy. The teachers at school started showing me more sympathy, but they didn't dare get too involved. They'd just give me pitying looks whenever anyone mentioned the word stepfather. The good news came on a stormy, rainy afternoon. Dad's lawyer called, his voice shaking with emotion. "Congratulations, the case file has been transferred to the High Court. The prosecutor has ordered a full review of all evidence, including the recordings, the journal, and company employees' testimonies. My dad would be temporarily released while the investigation was reopened." That night, for the first time in months, I got to sit next to my dad, even if it was just outside the courthouse, under the pale yellow glow of streetlights, amidst the sound of car horns. Dad looked at me and gave a tired smile. "You did great. Sometimes even just one kid can change the whole game." I just hugged him tightly, the tears flowing uncontrollably. Richard completely vanished from our lives after being taken into custody to await trial for forgery, slander, and obstruction of justice. My mom had to face the biggest crisis of faith in her life, but at least she apologized to me, hesitant and quietly. My family would never be the same, but at least our injustice had been lifted. I went back to school, still the kid who stayed silent in the face of rumors, but now filled with new hope inside. I knew these wounds would take a long time to heal. But most importantly, I had chosen to stand on the side of truth, and I would never regret it. As I close this chapter, I want to send a message to anyone who's ever felt alone when standing up against injustice. Don't ever give up. Sometimes all it takes is refusing to stay silent, and the truth will find its own way out. Justice might. Chapter 10. The day justice knocked. The day my dad was officially acquitted happened on a sunny morning, but to me it still felt like living in a dream I had waited for far too long. The courtroom was packed, reporters, family members, former co-workers, faces that once turned their backs on my dad, now present to hear the final verdict. Dad's lawyer went over the entire reinvestigation, the overlooked evidence, the crucial recording from the watch, and new witnesses who dared to come forward thanks to the wave of truth spreading. No one had any arguments left to defend Richard, not even my mom, who didn't dare sit near him anymore. I looked over at Richard and saw him pale and shaking his hands, trembling nonstop. All his power, his control, His arrogance disappeared in the moment the truth was revealed. The court declared my dad innocent and released him on the spot. Richard was led away, facing prison and a string of new charges that had come to light. I saw true fear in his eyes, the kind that comes from realizing you can't manipulate the truth forever. In that moment, I didn't feel triumphant or vengeful. I just felt relieved and free. After Dad was released, the two of us hugged for a long time, right there at the courthouse doors. We didn't need to say anything, didn't need to apologize for the lost days. There was only the feeling that all the effort, all the wounds, all the loneliness had been worth it. At home, my mom tried to make amends, but everything had changed. She started therapy to heal and learn how to recognize manipulators around her. Dad focused on rebuilding his career from scratch, but this time he included me in every important decision as a way to thank me for never giving up. I gradually returned to a normal life, started playing soccer again, studied harder, and kept up the habit of journaling. But every time I looked at the box, full of roar means I love you and dinosaur notes, I knew I'd never be as innocent as before. I also understood that sometimes growing up means facing the darkness and believing that the light will come at the end. This story, even though it ends with a just verdict, still leaves scars on each of us. But I believe that pain will turn into strength for me, for my family, and for anyone who's ever been betrayed to stand up, protect the truth, and protect themselves. And if anyone ever asks me, was it worth it? I'll say more than anything. Because justice isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new life, where trust can take root again, even in soil that was once shattered. Thank you for staying with me until the very end of today's story. There are times when the truth gets buried by power and lies, but as long as there's one person who refuses to stay silent, justice will always find a way. Even if this journey comes at the cost of tears, loss, and a stolen childhood, today's storyteller chose not to give up, and in return, found freedom, hope, and a new, stronger family born from hardship. If this story resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Have you ever stood up for the truth yourself? True Reddit Reads will be back with more dramatic, emotional, and gripping stories from the Reddit community. See you in the next video.